Hey, everybody, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and here tonight with another of our virtual events. And this time I'm really excited. I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time. This is we're just kind of going down memory lane. My old friend, Tod Goldberg. Welcome to the show, Tod. It's great to see you again.
It's great to see you too. I should be in your store right now. This is the end of my first week with a new book out. So typically I do a signing in LA. I do a signing in San Diego, and then I'd fly to Phoenix, and then off to San Francisco.
Yeah,
this is very upsetting.
So we're about a week into. I understand it came out on the second. The absolutely terrific new collection of stories called The Low Desert. And Tod, wow, this is getting a lot of attention all over the place. I've been looking and seeing all the press that you're getting. Deservedly so. I mean, it's a really remarkable collection of stories. God, where to begin? We first met back when your debut novel, Living Dead Girl, came out.
That was actually my second one, but my first good one.
Excuse me. Yeah, that's right. Was the first one a collection of short stories?
No, the first one was a novel also, but it was bad.
Sorry, got it. I'm remembering this red
back there somewhere.
anyway. And so and you've had a long distinguished career since then, and you feel like you're only getting started, or you're only kind of picking up steam?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I didn't really consider myself a crime writer for a really long time. My first two books, the first one's called Fake Liar Cheat, and then the second one was called Living Dead Girl. And I met you when Living Dead Girl came out. It came out, and I signed in the store a million years ago. It was me and Peter Lovesey signed together.
It's good company.
And Cara Black. And I was scared to death to meet Peter, by the way. I remember it like it was yesterday. Just scared to death. And he was just he was a wonderful human being. It was like meeting Peter Graves, actually. But I was 29 when my first book came out, and I thought I was going to win Pulitzer prizes, and that I would be, they'd be feeding me with Faulkner and all these crazy ideas that you have when you're young. And I didn't really start to view myself as a crime writer until I started to write Burn Notice, to be perfectly honest. And I wrote the Burn Notice books. Those are my, my fifth or my sixth through 10th books or something like that. And that was the point in time in my career when I really just decided, this is what I want to do. Why have I been pretending to write anything other than what I want to write? Yeah. And those books sort of set me on that path that, after that, I wrote Gangster Land, and that sort of changed the course of my career completely. And so in my mind, these last four books really have been the career that I thought that I was going to have as a crime writer.
That's interesting. Did you feel like with the Cupertino novels that you really kind of arrived at, this is my voice, this is the discovery?
For sure. And this is something I talk to my students about a lot also. I'd reached the point where my ambition had met my talent, to be perfectly honest with you. Like, I knew how to do the things I wanted to do, and I saw clearly how to write this particular character. So Gangster Land, for those of you that are watching and you thought this was going to be, about COVID.
We'll get into that.
Is a Chicago hitman who hides out in Las Vegas as a rabbi. That's the one line about these books. And when I finally sat down to write that book, I'd written a short story about that character before that had appeared in my book, Other Resort Cities. And after I wrote that short story, I was like, oh, this is what I meant to do. I meant to write about this guy, because it pairs up what I'm really interested in, sort of a serious look at faith and religion and empathy and consequences, and just an absolutely stupid hairball idea of having a hitman pretend to be a rabbi. Can I pair those two things up and write the kind of book that only I could write? And it turns out that I could. And that was an awakening moment for me of like, okay, like this is what I'm able to do now. I had that skill set. And then when I wrote these stories, when I wrote The Low Desert, there's really sort of a charting in that book about where I want to go after I finish these Sal Cupertine books, because I'm really interested in writing about organized crime at the Salton Sea. in the 1950s and the 1960s, which is another passion of mine that I've been sort of writing around for years and years as well, but which plays a big role in this book.
Right. Well, I'd like to get into the book itself, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to kind of approach it. That area, I grew up. My grandmother lived in Los Angeles, and that's where my mom's family's from. And as a kid, I grew up going back and forth across the desert, through all those communities. And they're always such fascinating places. You go by Hadley's, you go by Morongo, and then you get into a little bit further into Colton and Banning and all these towns, and I've always thought, I wonder what life is like in these towns.
Right.
And especially Indio, we're getting closer to your terrain, Palm Desert, and you grew up in, was it Palm Springs or Palm Desert or?
Yeah, well, I split my time, not in a way like I'm Ashton Kutcher or something, but for the first 15 years of my life, I lived in the Bay Area. My mom was a journalist. My dad was a TV news journalist in the Bay Area. And then my mom got a job working as a journalist in Palm Springs as the society columnist for the local paper. And so we moved here when I was my first year in high school. But we'd been coming down to the desert. Our families had been since the 1950s, because Palm Springs at the time was basically the only place where Jews could go to play golf. And so my grandparents on both sides lived in the Pacific Northwest. On my mom's side in Walla Walla, Washington. On my dad's side in Portland, Oregon, and Longview, Washington. And so they all had homes or condos down here, from the 50s onward. So I was already really familiar with this place. And to be honest with you, I was already a little transfixed by how weird this place is. I mean, it's living in a resort town, as living, in Scottsdale, but of course, Scottsdale's in a big sort of metropolitan area. But living in a resort town is weird. People come and go and they pretend to be different people because they can. There's this sense that when you're there visiting, you're entitled to be treated a certain way. People are going to wait on you. And so even as a kid, when I come to visit, I would find that odd. And then when I lived here full time, and my friends' parents were, working in hotels or working in restaurants or owning nightclubs and things like that. It's not like what it was in the Bay Area, where all my friends' parents, worked in, were lawyers and accountants and worked for, Bechtel or whatever. It's an entirely different point of view when you are in a resort place. And so I've always thought of it as, it's beautiful, but there's a real grimy underbelly to it. And that's true of any resort town. I love a resort town in the morning before everyone's out and they're cleaning up all the crap. That's when I love a resort town.
Well, I like the idea, and I was going to kind of ask you a little bit more about your mom as the society columnist, and what a wonderful source of information. When I think of that area, I think of, on one hand, meth labs and, Palmdale and that whole area, let's say from the Imperial Valley up through Palmdale and that area is so fascinating on so many levels. And I just know a teeny little bit from reading William Volman and
yeah. Volman's book Imperial is great. That's the book to read if you want to know about how dark and desperate, all the desert cities really can be. That, and you're right, that stretch of Imperial Valley up to just past LA County where Palmdale is, if you go the back way through it, it's connected by no big towns. It's just dots on a highway, and none of them connect to anything good.
Right. But this disparity between the little enclave of uber wealth in Palm Springs and the Hollywood connection, and then the opposite side, which is fascinating in your book. You really explore that kind of disparity. Wow.
Yeah, and when my mom was the society columnist out here, and she did it for a very long time, it was a weird time. It was the 1980s, and then it was the late 1990s, And it was this period of time in Palm Springs where, to be perfectly honest with you, like, organized crime was prevalent. Everyone knew that Palm Springs was an open city. And so Chicago outfit guys and New York Five Families guys all owned restaurants up and down Palm Canyon and East Palm Canyon, which is the main thoroughfare that runs through the Coachella Valley, and then becomes Highway 111, which stretches all the way from Palm Springs to the Salton Sea. But these mafia dudes owned everything. Like, it was a mafia-owned town, but because it's an open city, and still is, there was no violence, because the agreement is you come here, you do your business, you don't screw over anybody else, no one's going to get shot, which is, that's an amazing thing to think about. But so when my mom was the society columnist in the 80s and 90s, her society beat was essentially covering old gangsters, pretending not to be gangsters, running restaurants, B-movie Hollywood actors, glamorous people coming in from Hollywood that had failed and were, wanted to, cash in essentially by living out here. And then locals involved in Ponzi schemes disguised as philanthropies. Like, there was just a series of Ponzi schemes that existed over and over and over again throughout the Coachella Valley. And my mom was always deeply involved in these things. But this was true even when we were kids. I know you had my brother Leon recently as well. But when we were in the Bay Area, my mom, she was a difficult person, but she was always dating guys that were like, oh, secret family somewhere else. They sell some sort of powder that will make you smarter, and they were deeply involved in est. It's like that was her guy that she gravitated to. And so it was almost like I was picking this stuff up through osmosis, living around this, because by the time I was living out here with her, I was the only one still left at home. So I got to see a lot of it firsthand. But I'm fascinated by that disparity between, the perception of glamour and wealth in Palm Springs, and then the reality of the profound, lack of money and social standing of people as you go east across the Coachella Valley. The poorest place in America for a long time was an area just outside of the Salton Sea called Duroville. And it, the average income there was like $2 a month, whereas the average income at the gated community across the street from mine is, $7 billion a year. And so that causes problems, and those problems invariably are criminal.
Let's talk about clowns. Why don't we? Let's talk about clowns.
I'm ready.
Right to it. Clowns feature memorably in this book. And I had no idea that they're quite ubiquitous in your area. Tell us about them.
So we won't ruin the story, but it's in the story of the Royal Californian. A clown appears. The fact is, in Palm Springs and in the general Coachella Valley, there are several different clowns who show up in restaurants and bars, and they expect you to give them money to take photos with them.
Really?
There's Harpo, who's been doing Harpo stuff for like 35 years. There's a woman who pretends to be Charlie Chaplin, and she shows up with the little cane and dances. There's a variety of clowns. And so sometimes you'll just be sitting at dinner in a nice restaurant, and you'll look up and there'll be a goddamn clown walking
like
into the restaurant.
Mariachi band that goes from table to table kind of a thing?
Yeah, but it's a clown. And he doesn't speak because he's Harpo. So not only is it creepy as hell that there's a clown in the steakhouse, it's a silent clown. There's
terrifying.
It's completely terrifying. There's a restaurant in Palm Desert called The Nest. And The Nest is where people over 70 go to hook up. Like, it is the primary place to get the HPV virus after 65 years old.
Park your golf cart out front, kind of a place.
Oh, that's not even a joke. That is actually true.
Is it really?
Yes. And you'll be in there. Not that I go there because I'm under 70, but if a tourist is in town and I say, do you want to see something weird? I will take them to The Nest, And you'll be sitting there and there'll be, 70-year-olds dancing to Baby Got Back, which is weird. And then out of the corner of your eye, a clown will walk across the dance floor. Patrick, it's highly disturbing. So in the Royal Californian, I memorialize what it's like to walk into a place and see that clown off duty.
That's like a little bit like, the King of the Hill, the Mike Judge.
Yes.
So, you know how Chuck Mangione will randomly appear
Mm-hmm.
in restaurants and, oh my God.
Yeah, it's very strange. And in fact, so if you're watching right now, if you Google Harpo the Clown in Palm Springs, you can go to his website and you can see pictures of him with celebrities. And somewhere the celebrity is telling the story. Like, I was walking down the street, like, goddamn clown rolled up.
I imagine he's trending right now.
God, I hope so.
Now, do any of the clowns appear in the same place at the same time?
My understanding is they got beef with one another. And so if one clown shows up where another clown is, like, they've got their turf really marked off. It's like, you don't want to mess with MS-13. You don't want to cross Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah.
You don't want that. Silent but Deadly with that cane. You don't want that.
You think there's an MS-12?
Probably.
Yeah. I don't want to fuck with them either. Well, it's funny. One of the things I really loved about this collection is the variety. I mean, there's two, and we can go from clowns. That's an awesome story, by the way. To this pair of stories, and I just wrote them down to remind myself. Palm Springs and Pilgrims, which for me, it was like, yeah, that's like the emotional heart of the book. Can you, without spoiling it, can you talk about those two pieces?
Yeah, Palm Springs is a story that is special to me, and so I'm always happy when people really respond to it. Palm Springs is a short story, and Pilgrims is also a short story, obviously, about the same character, a cocktail waitress named Tanya, who hits a flush in Caribbean stud while living in Las Vegas and decides almost on a whim to adopt a child from Russia in the 1990s. And this doesn't spoil anything. You learned about it, very early in the first short story in Pilgrims. The child disappears, runs away, or disappears in some way. She doesn't know what happens to her. And the stories essentially examine what happens when a pebble is thrown into a body of water. And that pebble in the case of these two stories is a gangster in Chicago jumps off of a building, or is thrown off of a building. You'll find out about page 16 in Chicago. And his death sets forth a series of events that eventually encircle this cocktail waitress's life. And so I wanted to talk about the circles that come from crime, and how a crime is not just about the people who commit it, but about the people who love the people involved somehow, or who encounter those people in some way. And the stories in the Low Desert in general, but Palm Springs and Pilgrims specifically, are about understanding the long tail of a crime, and what that means to just a common individual that you might walk by on the street and never once think that their life was at all interesting in the least. And I wanted to hang a lantern over that cocktail waitress, over Tanya and her life, and show what that gangster going off that building ended up causing for her. And it's not your average crime story. Those two stories, Palm Springs and Pilgrims, are crime stories. But it takes another story, which we won't talk about, for you to really understand why they are crime stories. And when you understand why they are crime stories, you're going to gasp, and you're going to go back and you're going to read those stories again.
Yeah. Well, let's get into, there are three stories, right, that are really interconnected about the Salton Sea,
right,
in this book. The title track, the title piece, the Low Desert, and what a fascinating. I've always been interested. I'm sure, like a lot of people who have heard about the Salton Sea, what a bizarre, strange story it is, and just a fascinating place. And it seems like a natural place to set crime stories. But you're the first one there, as far as I know. Tell me
Must be
about
knocking on wood.
yeah, and I'm assuming that you're in the future you're going to revisit that terrain. It seems like it deserves a novel.
Yeah, I want to. I really want to. And I don't know if it'll be books or a TV show or what it will be, but it will be something. I'm fascinated by the Salton Sea in not only because it's 35 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. But when I lived here as a kid, we'd go out there and we'd go through the ruins of the Salton Sea. And this is when um, so right now the Salton Sea is receding. In the 1980s, it had flooded over its banks and had claimed the town essentially. And so you could go up to the Salton Sea, and there would be light towers sticking out of the water, power lines sticking out of the water, houses sticking out of the water. And I was just fascinated by it. It was like one of those towns that you read about where they had a mining company buys a town and fills a dam on top of it, like they would do in the East Coast. It was like that. And I was I was immediately struck by it, but I didn't know, for years and years I didn't know what story could take place there. And the first short story that I wrote about the Salton Sea is a story called The Salt, which is in this book, and a previous version of it appeared in a previous book of mine. But I rewrote it for this one. And I knew I wanted to write about the origins of the grift of the Salton Sea. So for those of you who don't know, the Salton Sea is a prehistoric salt basin that was part of essentially the ocean for the first several million years. And it emptied out. And for a while, it was what the Native Americans called Lake Kawia. And that was about 14,000 years ago. It was Lake Kawia. And then slowly but surely, Lake Kawia evaporated, and it was just a giant salt flat, about 50 miles in length. And for many, many years, people wanted to rewild this area. They wanted to fill in this salt flat with water from the Columbia River and build essentially an inland Riviera. And they had this plan from the 1800s onward. Finally, in 1905, the story was that the Columbia River had jumped its banks and filled this salt pan. It was intentional. And the Salton Sea was born. And for the next 50 years after this ecological disaster, grifter after grifter after grifter came in and tried to turn this huge body of water. And it's very strange because it's right at eye level, because you're actually beneath sea level there. You're at the lowest point in America when you're at the Salton Sea.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's really strange. And it goes up and down, like which one's the lowest point. There's one other place that I think might sometimes be lower by a foot. But it's, so you're driving and the water is at your eyes. It's a really strange experience. And so in the 1950s and the 1960s, this is the true story that I'm writing adjacent to, essentially. There was a mob guy and land developer and oil man named Ray Ryan, who helped develop Palm Springs. He was a Chicago gangster, though. He was associated with the outfit. And he helped develop Palm Springs to the point that they called him Mr. Palm Springs. And he developed the beginnings of this resort at the Salton Sea. So if you ever go and look at photos of like the races that were going on in the Salton Sea in the 50s and Desi Arnaz, partying with Frank Sinatra, this is all because of this gangster, Ray Ryan. They built the infrastructure for a town of 150,000 people beneath it. They had all these contracts, but it was just a grift. They knew it was never going to work. And eventually everyone literally pulled up stakes and left. And part of the problem with this grift is that this guy, Ray Ryan, that was involved with it, had screwed over a lot of gangsters. But he stayed in Palm Springs for as long as he possibly could because of the agreement. Like if you're in Palm Springs, they're not going to kill you. So he didn't end up getting killed until the 1980s in Evansville when they blew up his car. they waited 30 years to get him. So the Salton Sea stories, I'm telling a true adjacent story about these oil company developers that were developing land out there. And there were a series of murders and, beatings and all that sort of stuff. And I'm using this character, Morris Drew as the conduit to tell the story that I want to tell.
And then over over a long period of time, you're telling the story, which is really cool. We get a sense of what was happening there. Would this have been in the early 60s?
Yeah. So the short story, The Low Desert, takes place in 1962.
Okay. And then it picks up later in what, the 90s or early 2000s, something like that.
Yeah, it picks up. So it shows him in the 1960s. It shows him in the 1990s, and then it picks up again in 2010, I think, something like that.
Right.
Which is, so part of it is I want to tell this guy's story, and I think it's interesting. The other part is me trying to figure out how I'm going to write this book. So I'm doing a little exercise as well on top of all of it. But I'm really interested in that story of the Salton Sea and telling that story. And it's the first time, other than the sort of hitman rabbi thing that I'm writing also, that I felt like, oh man, this is the thing that only I can do. You know, this is the story that I can write. Also because I'm the only novelist that lives anywhere near it. So, so I've put my claim in.
Well, it's funny because before we actually got started here, we were talking a little bit about the writer Richard Lang, who we both like, and he, like yourself. I mean, the reason I bring him up is that he's somebody who's equally adept at writing short fiction and writing novels, which is not terribly common these days. You don't see that. It seems like with these short pieces, I don't know if I've question framed really, but do you have a preference between short fiction and long fiction? I'm sure they each have their different demands.
Yeah, you know, if I didn't like to eat.
Right, screenplays, kid.
Yeah, I would just write short stories. I love the short story. I love it as a form. I love it creatively because I can try on, 1,000 different outfits. If something excites me, I can take a moment and examine it. There's a story in the book called Goon Number 4, which is just a straight satire. And like, I'm not going to write a 400-page satire, but I might write an 8,000-word satire to, that does the thing I'm feeling right now. And that's what short stories do for me. But it's a completely different form of the art, than writing a novel. The short story is more closely related to a poem than it is a novel, to be perfectly honest with you, in terms of what the form requires, which is instantaneous emotion. You got to be in the thing immediately. You've got one page to get the emotion going in a short story. And in a poem, you've got a line, basically. A novel, you might not have a strong, visceral emotion about empathy or sympathy or something for 50 or 100 pages. You don't have that in the story. And so I try to hook you in a short story emotionally for someone in the first line. I try to give you a sense of who that character is and what their conflict is before you even have a sense of what the story is going to be about. So I just love it. And that's what Richard Lang does too. I mean, he's a genius. His short story, Bank of America, is one of the best short crime stories ever. It's for those of you that are out there watching, it's a bank robber, reflecting on basically his last job. And it's just a great, amazing story in his collection, Dead Boys. Just love it. One of my favorites.
Yeah, he's damn good. Actually, I wanted to ask you about Goon Number 4. That was such a fun story. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so one of my heroes, Lawrence Block, emailed me and asked me if I would write a short story for him for an anthology called The Darkling Halls of Ivy. And he said, you can do whatever you want. It just has to have some connection to academia. And like, look, if Lawrence Block emails you and says, do you want to write a short story? The answer is yes.
Yeah,
like, it's like, oh, hey, God called, wanted to know if you want a gate. Yes, I'll take the gate, God. I mean, number one, I can't ever believe when he speaks to me, it's just, that seems weird. Like, that's Lawrence Block. He's been living on my bookshelves since I was like 7 years old. So I was like, well, I got to write a short story that Lawrence Block is really going to like, because my fear was I would send him the short story and he'd be like, oh, I thought I was writing Lee. I didn't I didn't know who you were. But I've always been fascinated with the guys in the background in crime books, in crime TV shows, and crime movies. Like there's always the main character, but then there's the dude holding the briefcase with the sunglasses on, and he drops it on the table and opens it up, and the money's in there. I'm always like, how did he get this job? And what does his mom think he's doing? And like, what's his sister up to? And does he have a dog? And you know, in a way, it's like the red shirts, right, from Star Trek. You're like, ah, he's gonna die in about 5.
Right.
Yep, he's dead. He's dead now.
Right.
And so over the years, like all the John Wick movies, I watched those, and I'm like, oh, that guy who just got stabbed in the eye. What was his life before John Wick stabbed him in the eye? And so I wanted to write a short story about the nameless goon in the background who decides like, that's it. You know, I'm done with this shit. I'm gonna go back to school and have a real life. And so that was the genesis of it, is like, what's it like when goon number 4 has to reacclimate to society? And there's a moment early on in the story. So again, this isn't a spoiler, but he ends up going to community college, and he ends up taking a class in radio production. And his teacher asks him what he does for a living, and he answers her honestly, says, oh, I'm a goon, an assassin, hired killer, just depends on the job. And the teacher just says, oh my God, can you imagine what that life must be like? And so no one ever believes him. And that was this thing that I wanted. I was like, I want to write this guy where no one believes it when he tells them the truth. And then, God, I just loved writing that story. I had so much goddamn fun, Patrick. It was the best.
I'll bet. Yeah. Have you seen that? What's that Bill Hader show that?
Oh, Barry.
That's a lot of fun. That must have been, yeah. That's good idea.
Yes, I agree. And Bill Hader's great. I've loved him since Adventureland.
Yeah, he's fantastic. You know, I forgot to say, for those of you watching, if you have questions for Tod, please go ahead and send them in. I'm kind of keeping an eye on my phone, looking for questions as they come in, and I'll ask him some. So don't be shy. Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about, you know, obviously your brother's Lee, terrific writer. I want to talk about living two writers in the same family. And was there a certain amount of sibling rivalry, or is there still, or is it, what's that like?
No. I mean, Lee is significantly older than me. He is much older than me. I mean, the dude is old. There are trees in the redwood forest that look at Lee Goldberg and are like, damn, that's what the future looks like. No, Lee is almost 10 years older than me. There's never been a rivalry in the least, because the fact of the matter is we're both each other's biggest fans. Yeah. And I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for Lee. I mean, you know, this thing that we do, I think the average person, I know this is true because as a person who runs an MFA program, I encounter folks every single day like this. In most families, if you said, oh, I want to be a crime novelist, they'd be like, are you on crack? You're not going to be a crime novelist. You know, go get a degree in botany or something. When I said that I wanted to be a professional writer, there's just like, okay, yeah, that seems fine. You should do that. Like, do that. Because Lee obviously is a professional writer, but my mom was a journalist. My dad was a journalist. My uncle was a writer. I mean, it's part of the family business. I mean, and it's not just my brother and myself. My two sisters have written books as well. They do. They've written a bunch of nonfiction books together and apart. And it's amazing to have a support system in your family of people who understand exactly what you're going through, even when you don't talk about it. You know, and so in that way, it's extraordinarily gratifying. The coolest thing for both of us, I think, is that we've gotten a chance to experience really fun, amazing, dream-worthy stuff together. And that's those moments where we're little kids and we can't believe we're in that situation. I remember there was this one time, this was years ago, we were at a book festival and Donald Westlake and I had been on a panel together, and it was, that was like, I couldn't believe that had happened to me. And then afterwards, Donald Westlake and Lee and I just hung out for an evening, and Donald Westlake let us ask him every dumb question we'd ever had for 30 years about everything. And it was like, why is this happening? This is the coolest thing that's ever happened to us.
Yeah.
And then there was a week where we were both on the New York Times bestseller list at the same exact time. Like that, it was amazing. Like I got the list before he got it, and I called him. I was like, Lee, you have the #1 bestseller in America this week, and I'm number 15. Like, this is amazing. This is crazy. This shouldn't happen to us. So I mean, it's crazy. The more practical side of it, though, is like, I don't know, 2 nights ago, a week ago at this point, I'm sitting in the living room watching television, and Lee calls and he's like, all right, if I throw you off of a boat and you're tied to an anchor, how can you get untied from the anchor without dying before you hit the bottom? And for the next hour, without him explaining any reason why he's asking me this question, the two of us try to figure out how I, thrown off of a boat with an anchor tied to my foot, would get out of this situation. And then at the end, I was like, what are you doing, by the way? He's like, oh yeah, I'm just writing the thing. Thanks, this is great. Like, so like that's the sibling conversations that we get to have. But he, you know, he paved this road that I get to run down. The cool thing, really, for both of us is that in addition to each other being thrilled by one another's success, you know, I think he's writing the best work of his entire life right now, and he thinks I'm writing the best work of my entire life right now. And we get to, you know, I get to tell him, like, dude, you're at a place now that you've never been. And I'm not saying this just because I'm your brother. I'm saying this as a book critic too. It's like, you are finally doing this thing differently than you've ever done it before, and it's paying off for you. And he'll call me and he'll be like, what? Like, you're reaching another level. Like you've found your groove. Like when people compare you to Elmore Leonard now, they're not lying. They mean it. And that's I mean, it's just awesome. I mean, it's just awesome. It's really cool to have that in our own family.
Now, does he live out in that area as well?
He lives in LA, so he's 2 hours away.
It's not too far.
No.
Yeah.
In normal times, we get to see each other all the time. But I haven't seen Lee except on Zoom in exactly a year. We went to an engagement party a year ago, like next week, and that was it.
Wow. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I was kind of watching to see who might be. Okay. I have somebody named Heather who asks. She says, "This collection has made me even more excited for the literary universe Tod has created. Can you tell us what else might be in store for the Gangster Land universe and its characters?"
I can. So there'll be a 3rd Gangster Land novel. I'm going to finish that very soon. If my editor is watching, I'm going to be.
So you haven't started, is what you're saying?
I'm very far into it, Patrick, and I am very angry with you for suggesting I have not written any part of it. But there'll be a 3rd Gangster Land book soon. The series was optioned by Amazon. The show's in development. We'll see where that goes. You never know with these things. But I'd tell you who's involved, but I can't. But you know, there's a big open universe for these characters, and it's not just about Sal Cupertine, Rabbi David Cohen. You know, his story will end. His story will end in the next book. That will be his bit. But what the Low Desert is doing, the stories in the Low Desert that are related to those books, is I intend to at some point continue growing this universe. So there are other stories to tell, other weird things that have gone on that I want to discuss. And so I imagine that I'll keep writing about these families and these people for a very long time. But the Rabbi Cohen story can't just be him quoting Bruce Springsteen, waiting for someone to show up that he kills. I can't just do that forever. I mean, I'd like to, but his story will have an ending, and I know where it ends. It won't be the end for him necessarily. I mean, we'll know on page 400, I suppose. But I know where these 3 books are going to land. But I love writing that character. you know, I think writers spend a good part of their career trying to find a character that they love to write, and that who it's easy for them to slide into that person's skin. The Rabbi David Cohen slash Sal Cupertine is real easy for me to slide into. He thinks a lot of the things that I think. And if I were tougher, acts on the things that I'd like to act on.
It's funny. Ian Rankin was talking about, writing his Inspector Rebus books. And I was struck by something that he said, which is, of course, makes perfect sense. And that was that, Rebus gives him a way of working out things that he sees in the world that bother him or that he doesn't understand. Do you feel that same way with writing? Does it help you kind of?
Oh, for sure. I'm not one of those people who believes that you write what you know. I believe you write what you don't know, what you're troubled by, what you want to examine. And the Gangster Land books are the perfect example. When I started Gangster Land, so it came out in 2014, so I started writing it in late in 2012, I guess. I'm not much of a Jew. I'm your average sort of bacon and mayonnaise Jew, but I was sort of having, a reckoning with my faith and a reckoning with who I was as a person and how I'd gotten to this place in my life. Both my parents were dead, and I suddenly had that moment where I found myself on the top of my family tree instead of being a branch, and wanting to examine what that felt like. And so that meant
with your much older brother Lee.
With my much older brother, ancient. Just they renamed ARP Lee. And so those books, while this character learns to be a rabbi, is also me sort of learning what it means to be Jewish on top of everything else. Because as he has to learn, so did I. I couldn't write about him until I knew what he knew. And so the evolution of those books is also an evolution of me understanding Judaism on top of everything else, and killing.
Good stuff to know, right?
Yeah, particularly these days. I'm very active on Nextdoor, Patrick, so I need to know these things.
That's right. That's right. Well, you mentioned a little bit about teaching, and you've been doing that for a while now, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
What's that like? Does that kind of re-energize you when you go back to your own work, or does it suck you dry? Some students are watching, so
it's extraordinarily edifying. So I'm a professor at UC Riverside, and I founded and direct my own graduate school in creative writing and writing for the performing arts.
Wow.
So if it didn't edify me, I wouldn't have done all that, because it's a huge responsibility. But I love it. It's absolutely remarkable. And I said this the other night somewhere else. It also puts the real onus on me to be good, to have my writing succeed, because if I'm going to model behavior for my students, I don't want Kirkus saying, like, Goldberg, who's never been worse, ... So I feel that when I'm writing a book, if I'm gonna guide these people are going to put their faith in me to guide them toward the thing that they want. I got to do it at a really high level. And I think that's played a significant part in the evolution of my career as a writer. The more important thing, though, in the teaching of creative writing, is it allows me to talk about the things that are troubling me in my own work through the guise of helping them. To have these conversations turns on something in your mind, like, oh, well, that solves that problem that I'm having. Or, it gives me a good reason to say, oh, I'm going to sit and I'm going to read, X book. And even though I've already read it, because I'm going to teach it, and also it's going to teach me something. I think of all the art that's out there, writing is the one art that is dependent upon a mentor-mentee system more than others. Like, you really need someone who's in your corner, who's reading your work and helping you along. And I value that a lot, and that's one of the best parts of my life. My wife and I don't have children, but I've got 800 students that have graduated from the program in the last 15 years.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's funny. My mom went to UCR back in the early '60s, I want to
Oh
say.
wow.
Yeah.
Highlanders.
What's that?
Go Highlanders.
Yes.
The
Um,
only Scottish themed UC. It
yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it?
is very strange.
Let's see. Before we kind of wrap up, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what I'm sure you've talked about it, but what this last year has been like for you. Has it been, we've interviewed so many writers, and you get, this real split. Some people were just paralyzed by the pandemic, but a lot of people seem to have picked up kind of in the second part of last year, and really, what's it been like for you?
Well, the first month I was just like everybody else. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I remember vividly in late January taking a screenshot of a news update on my phone that said, "Oh, something's going on in China," and posting it on the internet like, "Oh, I've seen this scene in the movie." Ha ha ha. Like, oh
Right.
my God. Like, that came true. Um, but my book was due at the end of April. So like round about April 1st, I was like, I've got to get to work. Like, I got to finish this thing. And so I became super productive essentially all of April. And then I had some scripts I was writing and a bunch of other stuff I was doing. So I was very productive. And to be honest with you, that the productivity allowed me to manage chaos a little bit. Um, I'm out here creating worlds that I'm in charge of, and I know how things are going to end. And if I don't like the way things are going, I can fix them.
Right.
And so this little area right here became a real haven for me. But too, in my role as the professor and the director of that creative writing program, I had to be a leader. You have to give these students and the professors that work for me um, some notion of calm. Some notion that, okay, everything else is out of control, but I am not. And I am going to manage this chaos, and we're going to do the thing that we do, and we're going to get through this thing. There's going to be an other side to this, and when that other side comes, we're going to be okay. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic. I mean, American democracy was crumbling around us too. So there's all of these issues that are going on. And so throughout it all, both in my writing and in my teaching and in public work, I was writing op-eds and things like that. I was trying to promote a notion of stability, if not physical, then intellectual. That there's a way through this, and it's it's going to depend on good, smart people doing good, smart things. So I was very productive, in fact, creatively from about April until September, and then for about 2 months I was like, what, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's just exhausting.
Yeah. I mean, I shouldn't be drunk when Rachel Maddow is talking. Like, it's 6 o'clock. I should be sober. But I've continued to be pretty productive and pretty good with it. But I have the same fears and concerns as anybody else. But I feel like as long as I'm in a position, particularly at UC Riverside, where I am controlling the path of the creative life of 100 students at any given time, and also being a boss, that I can't fall apart. So what I imagine is when I get inoculated, I'm gonna lose it.
All of that pent up.
Yeah.
Well, hey, you've got Rube Goldberg there to be your
Yes.
power animal.
Somewhere around here is a Cocker Spaniel named Rube Goldberg. She's a complicated game of a dog.
Really? Yes.
Look, Patrick, if you have a chance to name your dog Rube Goldberg, you take
You
it.
take it. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because my wife is a science and math teacher, and she's had kids doing elaborate Rube Goldberg setups. It's pretty fun.
That is cool.
Well, it's funny. This last year, from a bookseller's perspective, has been, it's been bizarre, but it's also been an incredibly strong year for books. Now, I thought 2020 was an absolutely killer year. I mean, some amazing stuff came out.
Mm-hmm.
What are, I'm not asking you to go back and just pick from 2020, but are there some that come to mind that you've read in the last year or so that have really?
Of the crime novels, I really liked David Joy's book, When These Mountains Burn. Is that what it's called?
That was fantastic. Yeah,
I loved that one.
me too.
I read a lot of poetry this last year. I found it very calming. So there in Arizona, there's a fantastic poet named Natalie Diaz. She had a new book out called Post-Colonial Love Poems. She teaches at ASU, for those of you in the greater Arizona region. I just read, actually, George Saunders' new book,
Yeah.
A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which I absolutely loved. Gosh, what else? There's been a ton. I'm looking at all my. So this is the nonfiction section.
Ah,
Fiction is in that room.
did you happen to read Ivy Pacota's?
Oh yes, I loved it. Loved these women.
But that was brilliant.
I loved these women, and Ivy and I went to graduate school together. So I've known Ivy for a very long time, and there might not be a bigger Ivy Pacota fan in America than me, and there might not be a bigger Tod Goldberg fan in America than Ivy. We're the two genre writers that ever came from the graduate school that we went to. So we are each other's personal cheering section. So her book was absolutely phenomenal. And Steph Chaw's book, Your House Will Pay, is I think one of the best novels of the last 15 years, like irrespective of genre. That was a book that I gave to everybody.
And also this book by Heather Young that came out called The Distant Dead. Did you read that?
No, I didn't.
Hell of a book. Yeah.
And that's up for the Edgar too, right?
Yeah, it was a great book. We had Ivy interviewing Heather for one of our virtual events.
Oh, right, because Heather and Ivy were classmates.
Yeah.
That's right. So three of us went to grad school together. I forgot. Yes. No, I haven't read Heather's book yet. But I read a ton of stuff that you'd think I could remember. Picnic in the Ruins. Great new crime novel. Todd Peterson. Absolutely fantastic crime novel.
Really? Don't know that one.
Oh, just came out. It's a really dark, messed up book, and it's also it takes place in the Utah desert.
Oh, cool.
So it's a good one. What else have I read that's good?
Well, there's a new Willy Vlowton novel coming out in April that will break your heart, man. That guy is so good.
I love Willy Vlowton. If I turned this computer around, you'd see a photo of Willy Vlowton and me on my corkboard there. So Willy Vlowton got inducted into the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame on the same night that I received the Silver Pen Award from the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. And it was the day after the election in 2016 in Reno, Nevada. And we had both flown back into Reno for this event, this award show. And the two of us were staring at each other like, and our wives were just like, what on earth just happened? It was one of the weirdest nights of my entire life. And I'm a huge fan of Willy Vlowton's band, Richmond Fontaine. And when I got the award, I told my wife, I was like, look, I'm going to do something that's a little embarrassing, but you get but a few chances in this life. And she was like, all right. And I got up on the stage and I'm doing my speech and I'm talking to everybody. And I was like, I just got to say, like, I never imagined that I would be sharing a stage with Willy Vlowton. Your band, Richmond Fontaine, has been playing in my head while I write for the last 15 years. So I'm going to sing one of your songs right now. And I broke into Capsized by Richmond Fontaine on the stage.
Oh my gosh.
And he seemed both overjoyed and upset about my lack of key.
Is that out there on YouTube somewhere? I should see if I can.
Probably. Oh God. Yeah. I'm a huge fan. Don't Sleep Out on Me was a great book, man. Great writer.
The DeLines are brilliant too. Have you heard?
Love them. Love the DeLines. Yes, so good.
And we should probably end on the Replacements since we're both big Replacements fans. Tell me about what they mean to you. Have you always been a fan?
Yeah, it's a funny thing when I think about the things that I like. and the things that inspire me. I've always been interested in the beautiful loser, you know? And I've written about him over and over and over and over again. Like that guy who just can't get out of his own goddamn way.
That's what I've heard for you.
And the Replacements are that band. I mean, they've sang those songs and they are those people. And so I've been a fan of them since I was 15 or 16 years old. And I've found myself to become a bigger fan over the years. And I just, you know, they're a soundtrack of despair and joy for me. And when I'm writing, if I need to get in the mood of writing about a guy who's about to make the right turn when he should have made the left turn, that's when I put on, you know, a little bit of Pleased to Meet Me, turn it up, and get typing. I love them. They're great. And I've been lucky in the last couple of years to inexplicably get to write about every new Replacements book. Every time a book about the Replacements comes out, some periodical contacts me and says, Todd, we'd like to pay you to read a book you would read anyway, and then write about it. Will you do that? Yeah, finally.
I was only aware of one, that Trouble Boys. Is there another one?
Yeah, there's another one called Lemon Jail by Bill Sullivan, who was their roadie.
Really?
That's a good one. Yeah. There was the book of the oral history of the Replacements, also, that came out a few years ago.
Okay.
There's one called there's also the great documentary Color Me Obsessed. There's like 10 Replacements books.
I'll be damned. Okay.
And you'll know them by my blurbs.
I did read the Alex Chilton biography that came out a few years ago. It's called a Man Called Destruction, and that's a hell of a biography.
Yeah,
you haven't read it.
Great. There's a great Big Star documentary that's on Netflix. I love that.
Yeah. Did you ever get a chance to see the Replacements?
Yeah, you know, the funny thing is I didn't get to see them until they reformed. So I saw them in 2014 at the Palladium in April, and it was a event where I cried in public on the middle of the Palladium floor. Oh my God, it was so good. And you know, the advantage of seeing them when they reformed is that they weren't drunk.
Yeah.
They knew the words to all of their songs and they played them at an expert level. And Josh Freese, one of the great drummers on the planet, was drumming for them, and not Chris Mars, who, while wonderful guy, I'm sure, and a lovely artist, not the drummer that Josh Freese is. It was a great show. Loved it. And then recently I saw Tommy Stinson. I'm pointing to something else you can't see. Tommy Stinson played a benefit show in the backyard of a house in Los Angeles.
Really?
For autism. And I went to that show. There's like 150 people there. It was great.
Wow.
And it was every sort of Replacements fan that ever been there, and then every Replacements associate who lived in LA at the time was there too. And I just sat there in the audience like this, staring at people. And then I met Tommy and I shook his hand and I said to him, "Pleased to meet you."
Oh, that's great.
And he's like, this fucking guy.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw the Replacements back then a couple of times, and you're right. Either they were way too messed up to play, or they were just drunk enough that they were great. You know? And I saw them in both states, but they never sounded better than when they reformed. I mean, they sounded tight and awesome.
They were great, and they played for like 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Played 25 songs or something. Oh, it was great. I loved it. And well, I knew that night that would be it.
Yeah, exactly. Although you never know.
Well, when they need money again, they'll
need money, exactly.
From 50-year-old punks, just like you and me.
Right. Exactly. Well, thanks everybody for indulging us as we wax about the Replacements. But Todd, congratulations on the success of this new book.
Thank you.
Couldn't be more excited for you. It's a phenomenal collection, and we still have a dwindling supply of signed copies here, although I may hit you up to sign some more if you're game.
Of course, always.
Yeah, but thanks so much for spending the hour with us, and hopefully I'll see you out here in the desert before too long.
Here's my promise. When the paperback comes out,
yeah,
I'm coming to Poison Pen and sitting right back there with you. And we're doing this live and in person again, because I absolutely miss going to all my favorite independent bookstores in America. There's no better one than Poison Pen.
Ding, 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 ding. Thanks so much, Todd.
My pleasure.
And I'll be talking to you soon. And thanks everybody on Facebook for enjoying this hour with us tonight.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.